So as a reminder, my name is Jenica. I'm coming from UMass Amherst in the Northeast Risk. And Northeast Risk is now closely aligned with Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center as well, which is a USGS funded regional center. So a quick outline of where we're going. I want to touch briefly on something that we call translational invasion ecology that I think might be a useful framework for this group to think about as we've been talking about how to maintain the conversation and maintain relationships and enthusiasm around the topics we've been talking about. I'll talk about the research modeling invasive plant range shifts and then finish talking about some strategies for management and how to implement some of these things. Realizing I should have turned my video on, so sorry, online folks, here I am. All right, and now I messed up my sharing. There we go. So many of you may not be familiar with the Northeast Risk. So we are a boundary spanning organization that aims to connect researchers with practitioners. These are generally land management professionals working in what we call minimally managed communities. So forest contexts, wetlands, riparian areas, things like that. We do that boundary spanning through a whole bunch of different mechanisms. So we do science synthesis, we host a lot of events and workshops, and we conduct priority research that's been identified by our stakeholders. And so this is just an image of like all of the different things that we do as an organization. I'm mostly going to talk about the things that are on the right-hand side of this image today. And the work that I'm going to talk about certainly is some of my own, but we have a huge group of people that are on the Northeast Risk leadership team. So this is the current team of about 30 people. I'll aim to highlight the leads on the projects that I'm going to share with you where I'm not the lead. But part of the reason that all of this works for Risk is because these people show up on a weekly basis for an hour and a half to do work. So that is our mechanism for making things happen. So I'll throw that out there, something for this group or a subset of this group to consider is having that core dedicated group of people to run this larger initiative. Our network as a whole is about 850 people at this point. So it is a strategy to kind of stay on the forefront of the conversation in our area. And this idea of translational invasion ecology is basically the codification of how we operate as a group. So it's in a published paper from 2021, and I don't want to spend too much time stepping through all of the details, but what I do want you to notice is how much purple is on that diagram. So that is boundary spanning activity. So that is work that the Northeast Risk leadership team is doing to connect researchers and practitioners around whatever the theme of the project is. So it's engaging people from the very beginning of, what research questions do we need to address? How do we address them? Is how we're addressing them meeting your needs? And then ultimately the outputs and the outcomes, meeting those needs in a more efficient and effective way. And of course, doing some evaluation to improve the process and feed into the next round of questions. And I want to acknowledge that there's a bunch of ways that invasive species and climate change interact. We've already heard about some of these today. So changing phenology, for example, I think we're going to hear more about some of these others. I'm specifically going to be talking about range shifting invasive species here. And so I hear a lot from our stakeholders of, we're already dealing with invasive species. Like, do we really need to layer climate change on top of all of those issues? And quite frankly, the answer is yes. So the IPBES report that was published in 2023, IPBES is basically the biodiversity equivalent of the IPCC. So the IPCC does the climate science synthesis, IPBES does the biodiversity science synthesis. And Climate change is going to be a part of this conversation around invasive species moving forward. There's really no way around it. And it's really focused on the establishment and spread phases of invasion, which is why it dovetails nicely with range shifts, which we're going to talk about. And so range shifts mean that the geographic areas on a map where a species can exist are going to be changing. You might hear the word distribution used synonymously with range. For our purposes, it's going to mean the same thing. But basically, what's the blob on a map where you expect to see a species? And we've really aimed to tackle three big questions. And I'll try to give you the highlight reel of the answers that we've discovered so far to these questions. So essentially, which geographic areas are most at risk from invasive plants specifically with climate change? And I should say we're focused on the lower 48 US states here. Which species are likely to shift their ranges and where are they going to go? And then how do we prioritize among those range shifting plants that we have identified? There's a lot of them, and so we can't focus on everything all the time. And so how do we come up with that ranked list? And I'm going to talk about ranges in really two different ways. One of them being occurrence ranges or establishment ranges. So just simply like, where can one or more of that organism exist? And then a subset of that range is called the abundance range. And so where within the occurrence range would we expect high abundance populations to be able to establish? In some cases, knowing just that it's going to be there is informative. In some cases, knowing that there's going to be a lot of it is informative. And so we've tried to tackle both things. And the general analytical framework that we use is called species distribution modeling, or SDM. And at the very highest level, there's a data collection phase that requires, georeferenced organismal data. So is the species there, or is it there and how much of it is there? Along with georeferenced environmental data, whatever parameters you think are important for determining the distribution of that species. We feed all of that into some modeling algorithm. We have multiple choices for what those models look like. But the outcome of those models is some sort of prediction map. So we have these georeferenced environmental data, relationships of the biological data with that environment that then allows us to predict in places where we haven't looked for the organism, would we expect to find it there or not? And so jumping to the punchline, we're going to pretend like we talked about all of the methods for how we got here. We've modeled the distributions of about 900 terrestrial invasive plant species in the United States under historical and mid-century future climate. And thanks for our earlier speakers for sort of setting me up so I don't have to explain too much. But these are based on 13 GCMs, based on CMIT 5, using RCP 4.5. So sort of like a middle of the road, mid-century climate change projection. And what you're looking at is the change in the number of invasive plant species we would expect to find with climate change. So an important piece of the story here is that this is based on the existing pool of invasive plants in the lower 48 states. So this is basically ignoring anything that hasn't yet made it to the US. And so you'll see the Northeast and the upper Midwest are kind of the losers in this story. Those areas are sort of that bright red-orange color, which means they are the recipients of many range-shifting invasive plants. You'll also notice that a lot of the country is shaded in blue, which is a reduction in the number of invasive plants that we would expect to see. So this sort of mirrors some of what we're seeing with the individual insect ranges, sort of expanded across, a large group of plants. And I always like to, give the asterisks that this is the existing plant pool, right? Like if we continue to have new introductions of invasive plants from elsewhere in the world, those blue areas don't stay blue. They just stay either the color that they are, the same number of richness or potentially even higher. So this helps us understand the where are we most concerned about range shifting invasive plants. We've also done some modeling of the abundance ranges. And the thing to note here, and yes, it's only the eastern half of the country so far, we're working on it, is that the Northeast still lights up as one of the places that is the recipient of high abundance population of range shifting plants. You do end up with a more diffuse pattern in the rest of the country, or rest of the eastern half of the country, in terms of increases and decreases of abundant invasive plant species, though. So the picture is a little bit different when you're looking at strictly high abundance species versus occurrences. And that could be for one of a couple different reasons. One of them being, there's a much smaller number of species that we've been able to model abundance for. Here it's 144, relative to the nearly 900 species that we can model occurrence for. And that again comes back to a data limitation problem. We've got really good occurrence data for lots and lots of invasive plant species in the US, thanks to places like EdMaps and other data clearinghouses. But we have a lot less abundance data across a large group of species. That's getting better over time, but 144 is certainly not 900. And I should also say, yes, we modeled 900 species for occurrence, but our candidate list of species was over 1,200. So there were still hundreds of species that were data deficient for modeling. And I don't want to spend too much time on this side by side of occurrence-based risk versus abundance-based risk, other than to say the scale is also really different. And so that's in part because we've modeled fewer species for abundance ranges. But it does help us to start that prioritization conversation of, okay, which species are co-occurring together in high abundance locations to help us identify those places on a map that need some perhaps extra special attention if we're trying to be proactive about containing these current invasive plants. So I'm going to start to transition now into how do we get this into the hands of people that can actually do something with it. And so some of this work has been funded by the Northeast IPM Center. So thanks to folks for supporting this work, as well as the Northeast CAST. So these products that I'm going to speak about I'm showing you images from the Northeast, but they're available nationally. And there's two things that I want to draw your attention to. So one is the species level range expansion maps. So that's the image on the left-hand side of the screen, the kind of orange and purple. And so that is at a county level trying to identify places where we expect for any given species, the range to maintain itself, so stay stable, expand, or potentially even retract with mid-century climate change. So it allows a land manager to go into the map on their location and say, what is going to happen with this focal species at my management unit? We also have these very green maps that are shown on the right, and we have these maps for both the occurrence ranges and the abundance ranges that display how many of the future climate models are in agreement that there will be suitable climate for this species in the given county. So basically, the darker the shade of green, the higher the agreement that species will be able to persist in that location. So it's not quite a quantification of uncertainty or certainty, but it's sort of the closest thing that we can provide with these modeling frameworks at the moment. So basically, if all of the models agree, then we're pretty sure that that's a place that's going to be suitable for that plant with mid-century climate change. We've also created a tool to create state-level watch lists So these are lists of invasive plants that are not yet present in the target state, but are expected to have suitable climate in that state by mid-century. So this tool was developed with a lot of stakeholder input. Very much started this project of like, surely this is what the tool should look like, and then brought it to a conference of practitioners, and they're like, well, that's not at all what we need. And so began an iterative process of creating something that was actually useful. Learning experience for me. But this tool allows people to select their state that they're interested in. It requires input of a number of GCMs that have to agree. So like I said, for these occurrence-based models, we used 13 different GCMs. So the user has to pick some level of certainty that is acceptable to them, anywhere from 1 to 13. And then they also have to choose how far away they want to look for range shifting plants. So for all lists, the criteria is that the species can't be established in the focal state. But depending on the search radius, it could be, so like this is a New York State example, this user only wanted to look for range shifting species that already exist within a 200-mile radius of New York. Like that's what their time horizon or dispersal kernel looks like. It could be that another user in New York wants to know if there's a range shifting species that only occurs right now in California, but it's an ornamental plant species and they think that it could, easily get shipped across the country. So they still want to be aware that it's a potential risk. Then they can, set that radius to include the entire United States. And so that's what the interactive map on the left-hand side shows, is what that search radius is. And then the right-hand side is the resulting watch list from the user specified parameters. And so these lists then can get used in whatever way, but one of the ways that people have used them is at the state level. So a lot of invasive plant regulations exist at the state level. There are invasive plant councils that dictate which species are regulated on a state-by-state basis. And so states have taken these watch lists, run them through their own evaluation processes. Every state has their own process, and then evaluated whether these are species that they want to proactively regulate in their state to sort of get ahead of the problem. And that has been especially relevant for ornamental invasive plants. Those tend to be the species that are, I don't want to call it straightforward to deal with, but they're more straightforward than accidental introductions. But we still got this reaction of like, this is a lot of species, so can you please help us prioritize these watch lists in some way? And so that's where another round of research came in to evaluate the impacts of invasive plants using a standardized methodology called ICAT, which stands for the Environmental Impact Classification for Alien Taxa. So this is a methodology that is now being used by the IUCN, for example. And one of the nice things about it, at least from my perspective as a researcher, is that it's well enough standardized that we can train undergraduate and graduate students to help us do these assessments. And so all of the people that are pictured on this slide are undergraduate students, grad students, and research technicians that were hired to work on this. And so it really involves using the peer-reviewed literature to look for impacts. So it's a standardized literature search where we read all of the returned titles and abstracts, which is thousands of papers typically. We identify which of those papers actually measure impacts. So that narrows the pool down, and then we actually read those papers to score the impacts on a set scale from minimal to major. And so to date, we've evaluated 3 sets of range shifting invasive plants, sort of focused on larger geographic regions. So we've done one for northern New England, southern New England, and the mid-Atlantic. And you're seeing the associated peer-reviewed publications with those analyses. Overall, we've evaluated 291 species, which was nearly 1,900 papers worth of review. It was a lot, which is why we need a small army of people helping us do all of that evaluation. And we've identified 54 high impact range shifting invasive plants. So we've taken, this list of 291 and narrowed it down to 54 across a pretty large geographic footprint. That then feels like a more tractable set of species to deal with. This is an example of what one of the data sheets looks like. So for every one of those 291 species, there's a file that looks like this that is publicly accessible. That includes the species names, all of the different impact mechanisms that are identified by ICAT, so competition, hybridization, etc. Whatever the maximum recorded impact was that we found in the literature, or not applicable if we didn't find literature about that mechanism. A summary of all of the impact scores for each mechanism, the number of studies. So it starts to give you a sense of how much information is behind each one of these scores. And then we also identified which habitats are affected by each of the mechanisms for each species. And so one of the things that I'll point out is many of the invasive plants in our northeastern footprint are forest invasive species. And so I think there's a lot of intersection with some of the things this group is thinking about and these impact assessments. And then dovetailing with one of the earlier conversations about different materials for different audiences, that's something we very much ascribe to at the Northeast Risk. Yes, we are publishing peer-reviewed papers. That is our academic currency. But we are also really aiming to do science synthesis that is relevant to practitioners. And so for nearly every paper that we publish, we create an associated synthesis or like a 2-page document called the Management Challenge. We've recently rebranded them to Research to Practice papers that aims to distill down the main messages of the research into sort of a visually appealing, easy to digest document that can get readily shared with a lot of different audiences. So like our partners at State Extension use these a lot in their communication with the general public, for example. So this is just a screenshot of one of the ones that was associated with some of the impact assessments. And then I mentioned that, we're working with invasive plant councils to work on proactively listing some of these range shifting species. This is a paper that we published a few years ago that was evaluating the level of proactivity and potential barriers in state invasive plant regulations to proactive listing. And what we found is that every state except for Rhode Island, because Rhode Island actually doesn't have an invasive plant list, a regulated invasive plant list. Every state in the Northeast plus New York has at least one proactively regulated plant, and that the most northernmost state of Maine is the current leader in thinking ahead about these range shifting species. They're sort of the farthest away, right? So they're like, they can see the train coming. So they're trying, especially in the ornamental plant trade, to try to get ahead of the problem before it arrives. We also facilitate a working group of the Northeast Invasive Plant Councils. If you look at the map on the lower left, you'll notice that the Northeast is unshaded. So this map is the sort of recognized regional invasive plant council networks. And there wasn't one in the Northeast. So while the group that we facilitate has no formal recognition. We've tried to fill that gap and continue to organize these twice-a-year meetings. They started in person, which was actually great for getting the group kicked off, and then COVID happened, and we had to learn how to do it online, and we've continued facilitating online since, which has the benefit of expanding the geographic reach of the people that can regularly participate. So we regularly have reps from 12 Northeastern and Mid-Atlantic IPCs from the US and some of the Canadian Maritimes. And putting the effort into facilitating this group really has actually led to some actionable outcomes. So many of those plants that are on the main regulatory list stem from conversations in this working group and additional support that we've provided to folks in Maine to make that happen. We have also really tried to pull together resources from each state. So like I said, every state does invasive plant regulations their own way, but many of them have completed evaluation sheets that they were willing to share. So we have sort of a password protected repository of those evaluations that members of this working group have access to. So, you know, if somebody in Massachusetts wants to evaluate a species that New York has already evaluated, they can at least see the data sources that went into that New York evaluation as a starting point for theirs. And I just want to end by saying that we're talking a lot about invasive species. And we also had a brief mention of, you know, what happens if we do nothing this morning. And that's where I want to end. So this is a recent paper that looked at observations of range change. So how quickly are species moving on the landscape? And this is specific to plants. There are other taxa in this paper if you're interested in those taxa, but I'm talking about plants, so that's all you're seeing here. You'll notice that the blue bars are really small. So those are native plant species. So native plants are not moving very quickly on the landscape. That orangish bar are non-native species that are moving without human assistance. And you'll notice that orange bar is, you know, quite a lot larger than the native species for both dicots and monocots. And then if you include human-mediated spread for the non-natives on top of that, it almost doubles that spread rate still. So the math works out that basically non-native species are expanding their ranges 100 times faster than native ranges. And so if we're thinking about, you know, sitting around and doing nothing about non-native species, ultimately what we end up with are ecosystems that are dominated by non-native species, right? Because the native species are not keeping pace with climate change. So that's both a call to action for figuring out how to curb the spread of non-natives, but also we have to come up with adaptation methods to help native species keep up as well. And that's where a lot of our work has been focusing over the last few years, is trying to work both sides of that coin. Both how do we identify what native plants are safe to facilitate their movement, and especially with ornamental plants, how do we identify those species that are shifting their ranges proactively so they're not money makers in the green industry in places where they're likely to have high impact in the future. So I feel like in my world, the ornamental plant industry often gets a bad rap as one of the facilitating mechanisms for the spread of invasive plants. But I would argue that they have a huge role to play in the climate adaptation and movement of native species as well. So, you know, they are a huge potential partner in this climate adaptation work. So recap, this is where we've been. Translational invasion ecology, a bunch of invasive species models, and then lots of stakeholder engagement for management. And we've gotten pretty good at engaging stakeholders. We really like sticky notes and lots of colors. It's great to be able to do workshops in person to elicit stakeholder feedback, but we've also gotten pretty good at doing it in a virtual world. And so I'm excited for the ways that, you know, the findings from this group and other reports that we've heard can use some of these same mechanisms to keep that momentum moving forward. I've talked a lot about the Northeast risk, and this is just a plug if you're not from the Northeast. The Northeast is the original, but now there are a number of different regional risks throughout the country. There's even a Canadian national ISC. No R, it's a NISC. So if this is something that has, you know, spurred your interest, but you work somewhere else in the country, certainly I would encourage you to connect to our region. Lots of funding has gone into the work and the stakeholder engagement that you've heard about. So thank you to all of those supporters. Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions and.
Yeah, this is really interesting. And this also applies to the insect study. So both, as I understand it, both models are relying on climate. But as we all know, plants depend on the soil that they live on, and insects depend on the hosts that they, and if those aren't there, they're not going to spread into those regions. Are there ways that soil maps can be integrated into this? Because I mean, there are national soil maps, there are coast range maps, I would assume, that could be integrated. And I know these are good starting places, but are there ways to expand this to make them more accurate? And would it be more accurate, or are they good enough?
I don't know if I can answer if they're good enough. Like I can give you model validation metrics, whether they're good enough for end users. What I will say is what individual land managers often want from us as modelers is what is going to happen on my specific property, right? Which is where soils and you know, the specific habitat that's at that location, those matter a lot. Those are hard things, hard variables to incorporate into a very coarse spatial resolution model. So usually if the goal is to have very site-specific predictions, we're using a different modeling technique altogether. We're for plants anyway, and it sounds like this is happening with insects too, we're using what's called process-based models that are using the biology of the focal species to make a prediction at a much finer spatial resolution. And those models do take into account the types of things that you're talking about.
Well, they can't. They don't. So like the models I was presenting on, those are the process-based models, and they can. And I just wanted to add to that, like a lot of the insects that we're modeling are polyphagous, so they have many host species. One of the exceptions, like is emerald ash borer, which obviously is just like an ash specialist. And so in that case, we did in like the publication show the range boundaries of like I showed like 16 native ash species in North America, and just kind of like highlighted the predictions within the range of the ash. And so you could display it that way, just like focus on the areas where their host is. That's one idea. So I guess the other thing too is that you could add more variables into your model, but then it becomes more species specific. And so like I was saying, like with our models, we're trying to keep it, even though some would argue it's complex, but we're trying to keep it not so complex you can apply it to like, you know, like many different species.
Yeah, because for example, in your map, the Rocky Mountains were brown, 100 species moving into the Rocky Mountains. I don't think so.
And I think that's where, well, so that's where the elevational effect comes in.
Yeah.
But
I mean, we do get invasives, but yeah.
Yeah, and so that's where, and that's a good observation. One of the caveats of these coarser resolution, large spatial scale models is you have to assume something about dispersal, right? So in the case of the models that I presented today, it's assuming unlimited dispersal. So species could be anywhere and can move to anywhere else that has suitable climate. You could make different assumptions about dispersal, and it would certainly shrink that number. Yeah, but then you get an argument about what assumptions you make and is that reasonable?
Yeah, I mean, they're great starting points. It's just, yeah, I like to think of, well, we have to include every bit of information, but maybe we don't.
I think it depends on what you want the model to do for you, right? If you want a really like species specifics, like fine resolution map, it by definition needs to be a different model than trying to understand across the entire country what species are likely to be moving around. Those are two really different questions and require different approaches.
So Deb online, Deb, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I just was thinking, you know, if you move native plants to a different range, does that mean they're then invasive in the new range? And how do you think about that?
Oh, you want to go there, Deb? Okay.
Just, I couldn't resist. It's okay.
Yeah, no, so this is actually something that we are actively grappling with as a group at Northeast Risk, but that the field in general is grappling with. And the question really becomes like, are the words and designations that we've used historically still relevant in a changing climate? I don't have the answer to those questions right now. I don't think any one person is going to be able to make that determination. What I will say is that the way I've been thinking about this, and a lot of my colleagues have been thinking about it, is that movement of genetic material within a species historic range has a certain risk associated with it, and then moving a species beyond its historical range margin just a little bit has a certain set of risk associated with it, and then moving a species way beyond its historical range margin has sort of a third type of risk associated with it. And we've been trying to use invasive species risk assessment tools to identify those different types of risk of moving native species. Because like you need the native species to be tolerant enough and robust enough to move beyond its current range margin where the conditions in some years might be suboptimal right now, but maybe in 10, 20 years might be optimal. But you don't want it to be so robust and so tolerant that it then misbehaves like an invasive species that has been introduced from somewhere else in the world. But I'll also say like some of this is already happening, right? So like I live in the Northeast. I go to the garden center. I've got purple coneflower that I can buy pretty much anywhere. That is not a Northeast native species. You know, prairie native species that looks pretty and behaves pretty well in a garden, right? You know, that's one example of many where it's already happening in the horticultural industry in particular. And so we're trying to put some of the framework and the science and the risk assessment around it to try to make those decisions in a more informed way.
All right, and on that note, I've got so many other places.
I think
But we'll get back to that.
Jeff online had his hand up too. I don't know.
So,
One quick,
Oh.
want to do Jeff?
Jeff. I missed your hand, sorry about that.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the talk. I have a question about the discussion earlier that the choice of a model is dependent on the resolution desired for a model prediction. Because it seems like one can develop a statistical model at coarse resolutions, but use fine resolution, for instance, climate data, to apply that model. And I guess I don't quite see that it's necessary to run a process-based model if you want fine resolution results. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I think about fine resolution model results, I feel like what people are often asking me for are very species specific predictions. Where there's sort of like a known set of environmental characteristics, or especially biological interactions or dispersal kernels that influence what happens with that species. And I'm hard pressed to think about what some of those variables would look like on a larger spatial scale. And so I keep thinking about this project that I was working on with glossy buckthorn, for example, and we had a set of land managers that wanted to understand, if I manage my buckthorn, but all of my neighbors don't, and they have established populations, what happens? Basically, like, how long does it take for reestablishment to occur? How often would I have to retreat? Those types of questions. And because the desired outcome was so dependent on those short distance dispersal events, it didn't feel appropriate to build a correlative model, and rather a process-based model was what we chose. But there's no way, kind of like for the level of detailed data that was required to build that model, that we could build that across a very large spatial gradient, because we would expect some of the parameters to be spatially varying. And we certainly couldn't build that kind of type of model across very many species. They just tend to be very like data demanding types of models. So that's my thinking.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, maybe that's a conversation us modelers can have at some point over for lunch.